Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of The Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at @TheImprintNews. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on social media. So I was going to do a whole headlines episode, but got a little crunched for time this week. And plus, I do have a short interview with Liz Ryan, who's the former head of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, among many other things, about a new project that she has started focused on media coverage of youth crime and the justice system. So to theme it out for once, I'm going to do some youth justice headlines today, along with that interview. And then I'm going to try and sneak in a second child welfare only headlines later in August amidst some work travel, which I think I'll be able to knock out. Next week, we have a great conversation with Barbara Duffield of Schoolhouse Connection about how youth homelessness is counted by different parts of the federal government and much more. Don't miss on that one. And then, like I said, I'm going to try to get another headlines done in August to catch up on the many child welfare headlines going on right now. And then we're going to take a brief summer hiatus towards the end of August and into Labor Day, and then be back with more great guests in the fall. We are set to hit the 250 episode mark in the middle of September, which is still so crazy to me. All right, so let's do some headlines, starting with a few from our pages at the Imprint. Early in August, an organization called Yeah Philly and its partner, the Galt Center, which is a national support organization for youth legal defense, released their roadmap to reform for probation, in particular juvenile probation. And the toolkit that they put out urges states to reimagine and transform youth probation orders, and it includes offers of best practices and guidance in that area. Now, the number of youth on probation in America is way down, according to federal statistics that the report cites. There were 106,300 youth on probation in 2023. That is down from 334,600 in 2005. And that is simply a function of the overall downward trajectory within youth justice. There's just less arrests of youth, less cases, less everything. As the Imprint's Michael Fitzgerald notes in his story, which I will, of course, post in the show notes, probation terms obviously vary from place to place, but the most consistent hallmarks are around control and limitations, things like home confinement, ankle monitoring, fees for youth, fees for parents, suspended driver's licenses, and drug testing. What the groups are calling for and trying to outline here is a vision of probation that would include much simpler to understand language for youth, because there is research that very often youth do not understand a lot of what the judge is telling them or putting in writing to them, that probation terms should typically last 3 months or less, and that it should be considered, and I'm quoting from Fitzgerald's story here, an opportunity for probation officers to support young people in reaching their full potential instead of a period of time that youth are, quote, surveilled, controlled, and punished. A number of states have raised the floor of juvenile justice systems in the past decade, and Minnesota is now poised to join them. A lot of juvenile justice reform in the 2000s really focused on the ceiling of the juvenile justice system, trying to raise the age at which you would be considered a youth in the eyes of the law, trying to make sure that 16 and 17-year-olds were at the very least presumptively youth in the eyes of the law, even though in virtually every state there were mechanisms to transfer them into adult court. But on the other side of the system, there's dozens of states where the law allowed for very small children to be processed in juvenile or even adult court, or just simply had no policy on the books whatsoever, which technically is worse, quote unquote, because if you have a floor, let's say it's 7 or something very young like that, it's at least a floor. I guess if you just don't have any policy at all, you are saying that a newborn theoretically could be processed in juvenile court. Of course, that would never happen, but you get my point. We actually did a great interview back in 2021 with Ricky Watson about campaigns to raise the floor. So I will drop a link in the show notes if anyone wants to go back and listen to that interview. He really kind of takes us through the lay of the land around the country. Before this law was passed in Minnesota, the floor there was 10. So if you were 10 years old, it was a possibility for you to be arrested and processed for your crime. Now, Minnesota is poised to become the third state to establish 13 as the floor, and that is the highest. Moving on to some headlines from local news outlets. I'm going to start with two that I picked largely because of a comment from a public official in both cases and what I think it kind of says about the moment we're in. First story is out of Mississippi. It deals with an overhaul of the youth court there that comes on the heels of a recent decision that amended the state's transfer laws to make it easier for the state to transfer very young teenagers into the adult court system. This bill was a little bit more mechanical, dealt with things like getting rid of some youth court referees, speeding up timelines in court, putting $21 million into refurbishing detention centers and to the existing development center, which is kind of like one of their youth prisons in Mississippi. So in this story about this bill, the Mississippi governor, Tate Reeves, is quoted. And actually, before I tell you what he said, I'll just note he convened a special session of the legislature and pushed this bill through with 24 hours notice to lawmakers, which ticked them off, some of them at least. But the quote that kind of caught my eye when he was talking about this bill is this one: "Our state will help youths who are able to be helped while also holding those who cannot be helped accountable." So let's put a pin in that one for a minute, come back to it. And let me describe the other one, which came out of New Mexico. So Bernalillo County District Attorney Sam Bregman, I think Bernalillo County is mostly just Albuquerque, was upset that prosecutors, including himself, were not invited by the state courts, corrections, and justice committee to a discussion they had about the policies around prosecuting minors as adults. So what we're going to set aside for our purposes today, whether the committee should have had them there. The committee chair is quoted in local news saying that they have heard from prosecutors already and wanted to hear from others. But here's the comment that caught my eye. Bregman said that the children's penal code were written long ago and needed updating along with more intervention services. And here's the quote that Bregman gave local news. "Back then, we were dealing with kids who were shoplifting. Perhaps the serious offense would have been stealing a car. Now we have kids that steal cars 3 or 4 times a month, and there's never a single consequence. In fact, there's not even a night in the D home." I'll add parenthetically, I think D home is like a detention center that they have. "And then they escalate it to guns, and then people get hurt tragically or horrifically killed." Now, as best as I can tell, and someone from New Mexico, please do correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the children's code of today, as it pertains to juvenile justice, appears to have been enacted in 1993. And just in terms of national historic trends, it is really hard to support what Bregman asserts, because 1993 was maybe the actual peak year, or very close to it, of the juvenile crime peak in this country that brought us, among other things, the rhetoric around teenage super predators, which would spur a very widespread practice of tough on crime, quote unquote, policies that expose a lot of youth to adult trials and sentences. So that's the national trend. Now, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention keeps some data on youth arrests. It goes back on their public site to 2000. So I looked at New Mexico's violent crime index for people under 18. So this is expressed as arrests per 100,000 in the population. In New Mexico in 2000, so 7 years after that code was written, there were 281 arrests of youth for violent crimes. So we're talking murder, homicide, rape, aggravated assaults on some order, 281 per 100,000. By 2010, that had gone down a bit to 240 per 100,000. 2019, it was 108 per 100,000. In 2020, which I didn't really want to count. It was down to 60 per 100,000. I'm sure that was tamped down by COVID. I would not be shocked at all if that number has gone up. And like in a lot of places around the country, spiked even in the years after COVID. I mentioned these two comments from the governor of Mississippi, and then I'm guessing probably the most prominent district attorney in New Mexico, because we've discussed on a recent episode, there's been an actual notable state bills on juvenile justice in the past few years that either roll back reforms of the past 3 decades or are introducing new policies, easing the transfer of youth into the adult system, including in Mississippi. And now we're kind of seeing the rhetoric match it in a way that's it's frankly not defensible. What the governor of Mississippi said isn't defensible. To parse the youth who are involved in the juvenile justice system as kids who could be helped and kids who can't be helped. The whole system is established. The idea for it is like it's built in that they can be helped. So I think I'll give him the grace of saying probably that was a poor choice of words. And I don't think he truly means that there is almost like half and half kids who are just irredeemable at the point of being a young teenager involved in his state's youth justice system. But there's a really unfortunate choice of words. I think that it may be the case that the more damaging one would be a district attorney just asserting that, hey, our laws were built around a time when kids were just shoplifting from their local convenience store, and that was all we ever saw. That was not the case. The 1990s were the peak of violent crime for youth in this country, or certainly the recent peak. So those laws were calibrated around that. And who's really around to call people out on this and patrol this stuff? Not many people. So anyway, thought I would call those ones out. On the backlash watch for a minute, maybe I should name a section of the podcast that just backlash watch every headlines edition. We have a new law being backlashed against in Vermont that never actually got almost entirely implemented. So here's the deal. In 2018, Vermont approved a law signed by its Republican governor, Phil Scott, who's still the governor, that would gradually increase the age of jurisdiction for the juvenile justice system all the way to age 22. I definitely remember it happening at the time and being like, whoa, this is well past anything that anybody else has done in this space. The push to raise the age that we talked about just 5 minutes ago really was focused on getting it to 18, not really going past that. And they were planning to go all the way to 22. And then the first years after, they did include 18-year-olds, but they stopped there. And now there's been a delayed onset of the rest of the law. And so now the Scott administration is proposing an indefinite pause in implementation, basically just saying that they would prefer to just keep it at 18, which, to be fair, is 1 year more than the vast majority of states even remotely have considered. The deputy director of Scott's Juvenile Justice and Child Welfare Administration, which is the Department of Children and Families there in Vermont, indicated in local press that part of the issue is about compelling participation in services. Here's the quote from Erika Radka. I hope I'm getting your name right, Erika. Since they are legally adults, we are not able to compel them to go into treatment and take specific actions. It's up to them to have a willingness to consent and engage. I read that quote a couple times and I'm not quite sure what she's getting at because it just feels like the justice system for adults pretty routinely compels behavior out of people. I know for sure that the child welfare system does that for adults who are involved with it. So anyway, legislators are seeking to have a meeting to discuss it, but this is a law that was a pioneering one back in 2018 that seems to be on hold for the moment. We have an interesting potential legal fight brewing in Washington state where 2 counties, Snohomish and Pierce, have gone to court to try and make the state the defendant in lawsuits over sexual and other abuse claims related to detention centers operated by those counties. So per the news report, which I'll drop in the show notes, there's dozens of pending lawsuits alleging abuse in these detention centers. And this is not unique only to these 2 counties. The reporting kind of suggests that there's quite a number of lawsuits, a number of places within the state. And so what these two counties are going to court to argue is that while they are involved and in fact in charge of staffing and managing these facilities, the state's court system is the entity that actually dictates the placement of youth into them. And therefore is the reason for their existence, basically. So essentially, that as court officiators, they run the local juvenile justice system. So again, per the local reporting, what we're talking about is probably coming up on $1 billion in exposure here. There's more than $700 million in potential costs estimated to be related to these cases, and the burden of those potential payouts and the expenditures to be involved with really expensive lawsuits. We have discussed the exposure of public government systems to the growing number of lawsuits around abuse allegations in mostly the child welfare space. I'm saying that's mostly what we've discussed. You might remember some conversations on the podcast that we've had about what's going on in California with liability insurance there, and the fact that there's a lot of private foster family agencies that are having a hard time affording liability insurance in the modern day. And it's very connected. It is not entirely causal of the growth in class action and just private lawsuits related to past abuse cases, both in facilities, in foster homes and things like that. So this is an example of that also being in play in the juvenile space. And we'll see what happens with this jurisdictional fight here. I'm going to wrap up the headlines with one out of my home state of Michigan. The Michigan Supreme Court has struck down a 50-year prison sentence that was imposed on a teenager from Detroit who was convicted of second-degree murder in a gang-related shooting. And what they found was that the sentence constitutes cruel or unusual punishment. Just for context, this case, the defendant was convicted of shooting a rival gang member. The sentence would have made him ineligible for parole until the year 2040, so roughly 48 years in. So the court held that sentence, creating such a lengthy parole wait, functions as a de facto life sentence and is unconstitutionally disproportionate for a juvenile. The most discerning juvenile justice policy wonks will want the question answered, does this apply retroactively? Because there's a lot more kids than just him who have received very lengthy sentences. That is the case. It applies retroactively to similar cases. And this all builds on other state Supreme Court action here in Michigan recently that has constrained extreme juvenile sentences following a landmark decision here that ruled that a mandatory life for offenders 20 and under were cruel and unusual. I think that the reason I raised this on a national podcast is that I think it contributes to, in my opinion, what feels like the next inevitable legal challenge on juvenile justice that the High Court, the Supreme Court of the United States, will at some point contemplate or take on. So the short course here on the history of juvenile justice sentencing or juvenile sentencing was the Supreme Court. I think it was 2005. They eliminated the death penalty. Then they moved on to ruling that conviction, life without parole sentences for non-homicides were cruel and unusual, and then moved down to mandatory life sentences, even when homicide was on the table. There's a case history, there's a very good kind of breakdown of this timeline that I'm going to drop in the show notes for everybody. So you just read up and not just take my blathering about it at face value. All to say, we've gotten to a place now where the next frontier of kind of carving out what is and isn't appropriate as a sentence for youth who are tried as adults is going to be the amount of time they are given outside of a life sentence. And this came up almost immediately and in my reporting after one of the very prominent landmark cases. I think it was Graham v. Florida, the one in which the court ruled that life without parole, without the possibility of parole for a non-homicide, was cruel and unusual. It was really what we were hearing from attorneys and legal experts at the time is, what are they going to do now when instead of seeking and getting a life without parole sentence, some prosecutor comes in and is seeking 90 years or 60 years or whatever amount of years? So Michigan, in this case, is saying we believe our view is that imposing 50 years on this teenager is de facto a life sentence. It is you are not going to get around our mandate that you cannot impose life without parole by giving him a number of years that we now view as essentially the same thing. And I just feel like it's inevitable that there's going to be enough of these laws in enough of states where we'll get that test case where somebody's going to appeal and say that's oppose it one way or the other. So I guess I'll cash that bet in when we see it bubble up into the appellate court, if that ever happens. All right, we're going to take a quick break and then be back with our conversation with Liz Ryan.
If you work in California's child welfare, foster care, or mental health services field, mark your calendar for August 31st through September 3rd. Stronger Together 2026, hosted by the California Alliance of Child and Family Services, brings 800 plus professionals to the Anaheim Marriott for 4 days of training, tools, and community. 80 sessions across 5 tracks, CE credits across 8 licensure types, and a room full of peers navigating the same funding pressures, policy shifts, and insurance challenges you are. This is where California's Child and Family Services community comes to connect and recharge. Join us in Anaheim. Learn more at cacfs.org.
One other thing I want to cover today or get our listeners in front of is a new side venture from Liz Ryan, who you've heard on this podcast before. She founded Campaign for Youth Justice and Youth First, and she was also the head of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention for Joe Biden. She's now on to talk to us about Report for Youth Justice and its related kind of print product here, online product anyway, the Youth Justice Style Guide. So Liz, welcome back to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. How you doing?
Thanks so much, John. I'm doing great, and it's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
So why don't you get a free shot to plug what you're trying to do here? I think I know I have maybe a couple of questions about it, but what is Report for Youth Justice?
The Report for Youth Justice is an initiative dedicated to improving the overall coverage in the media of young people. And it's designed for reporters so that they can provide fairer, more complete stories about young people. The initiative will release occasional papers. I released one this week about how the media cover young people. And it will also have guidelines, recommendations for reporters. So it's very solutions oriented to reporters. And being that I'm in journalism school myself, it's actually these kind of things I think go together pretty well.
I think most reporters will be pleasantly surprised that when they open up the style guide, it's not just a boring old style guide with just like a list of things alphabetically that you need to know, which is important and every publication has it. But I think it's a cheeky name for something where you're going to write different contextual pieces, right? Like you're going to,
exactly. Like this week, I released a paper looking at the last 20 years worth of research about how the media covers young people and issues impacting young people. And when are young people in the media? How is the coverage? How do readers, audiences take in that coverage? How does that impact their views? And then how does that impact public policy? And no surprise, John, it's young people aren't in the media very much. And when they are, it's always in connection with some problem like juvenile crime. And what's covered doesn't match up with what the data shows. So these are things that many reporters likely already know, but I'm pointing them towards ways that they can address the coverage, things they can do in their own newsroom, things they can do as a journalist.
So give us a little teaser of some ones you have in mind. What are the topics and subjects you're going to be taking in the style guide?
So in the style guide, I'm going to be taking on teen takeovers and how that coverage has been over the summer. I don't want to wait for a big, rigorous evaluation type study to impact public policy. I think reporters need to know what's going on now with how the coverage is, what some of the problems are associated with it, and some things that they can do themselves to fix that. So that's going to be one. I also want to talk a lot about sources. One of the findings in the report released this week showed that very, very seldom are young people themselves ever interviewed by media. And I know in your adventures, they always are, but other folks are not doing that. And I think that's a problem because young people really have ideas about what they think should be, how they should be covered. And also, they want to see more positive news and more news about things that affect them. So, those are things that I want to cover. I also think it's really important to hear from the field. I know I've asked people to give me a sense of what's not being covered. Like, we have questions about the coverage that's happening, but what's not being covered that should be covered. And those are things I want to write about. And again, giving some tools and ideas and contacts and data and research for journalists who are inclined to kind of take this up.
Yeah, and I'll post a link to Liz's first piece here, which is entitled How Media Can Change Its Coverage of Youth. But as I was reading through it, it really, tell me if you disagree with this, but I think your critique made me think it, for you and probably many others, this boils down to three buckets. Things you don't think the media should cover on some level, choices about what to cover, which we all make, right? We all have to decide. You only have so many reporters and time to deploy them and all that. Coverage that is rational but needs to be more contextual or differently reported. And then the bucket that you just referred to, which is this is out there and doesn't get any attention. Is that fair to say? Those are the three things you're taking on here?
Yeah, John, you've boiled it down to the three key points. And the interesting thing is that there are a lot of things that reporters can do right now to fix the coverage that they're doing right now, things they get assigned.
Yeah.
But I think in order to reverse this decades long pattern of negative coverage around young people, particularly in connection with violent crime, it's going to take a big effort by newsrooms to really invest in reporting on non youth crime related issues, right? Things that young people are doing in their communities to contribute, things that young people care about or are concerned about, getting young people's perspectives on the future, all of those kind of things. And that's a longer term effort, right? So this is going to get at both of those things. And of course, as you said, things that are being covered now that are problematic.
So let's talk about that box for a second of
Yeah.
what, in your view, shouldn't get covered. Because I think there'd probably be an interesting thing to kind of canvas people on. But in your opinion, like I would imagine one of the things that gets tricky here is one of the big suppliers of reporting on any crime that's committed is that there are crime beats and there's crime reporters whose job is to listen to police scanners, find out what's going on, go out there or cover the progression and trials of things that they've already written about, right? In your view, is it just you don't think that one-off crimes committed by youth should be covered? Or do you perceive them to be covered more often than, or are more likely to be covered than a similar crime committed by an adult, allegedly?
So it's the nuances really matter here, right? So the first thing is I'm not telling a reporter not to cover that. What I am saying is that they need to cover it in the broader context, right? This kind of episodic coverage of the one-time thing. And then it's a barrage of that, right? That coverage gets amplified all over the place. And then it makes it feel to an audience that there's a youth crime wave, which there is not. So that's where I think that who they're sourcing, they have law enforcement primarily listening to police scanners, like you just said, or they're just getting the MPD's press release, or they're just only having law enforcement on. They need to balance that with other perspectives. They need to have criminologists on there, people who are community leaders. They need to have young people themselves. So I think that they need to broaden the context. I think they need to broaden the sourcing. I think they need to look at the data and the trends, right? It also doesn't make sense. They're leading with the very thing that gives people the sense that there's a youth crime wave when the exact opposite thing is happening data wise, right? So I think some of it is how newsrooms choose to cover the story, but I think some of it is also about investing resources into longer term investigative stories. I want them to cover the justice system. I just don't want them to cover individual episodic crimes as if that's the only thing happening in the system. They should look further upstream what's going on in communities that are under resourced and not receiving grant funding to do the right kind of programs for young people. But I think also looking at what some of the challenges are in the justice system, things that aren't working. Plus, I do think we should see more about what's working. This week, we saw a terrific article in The Advocate in New Orleans on the multi area resource center, the MARC.
Yep. Yeah.
And
Seem like good numbers.
yeah,
Yeah.
really good piece, in depth by a young journalist, right? Somebody who wanted to cover something positive. And I think that's the kind of thing also that gives some solutions to some of this, because people, they get this negative news stories and there's never something attached to it that gives it a broader context or something that we can do instead.
Yeah, that's it. It's interesting. I think the biggest challenge, I think I talked to Alex Beccaro on the podcast like 2 years ago about the same thing. Like one of the challenges with improving the, let's call it the robustness of same day stories about crimes that are committed or an increment in a trial is that is what is called feed the beast news. And the person writing that probably has an expectation of 30 stories that week or some crazy thing that I get stressed even thinking about what reporters are asked to do. And it almost, to me, seems like the only way to combat the story that is just this bad thing happened, police quote, maybe some person that's on the scene when you're there react, and that's the story, is if somebody has this stuff on the ready. So has a thing they can just quick hit for those data contexts, and or maybe your resource now. So like people that are able to reliably in real time provide stuff that they can look it up. I thought the example that so I'll be interested to see what you do on the teen takeovers, because I think that's a good example of like a middle story, right? You'd be crazy as a editorial staff in a place where those things have happened to not report on them, but you want to do that with context and a lot of different viewpoints and all of that stuff, right?
Yeah,
sure. That's like people would wonder why you wouldn't.
Yeah, but there's so many decisions. So I'm not saying they shouldn't cover that. I just think there's ways to cover it. I've spent the greater part of today looking at news coverage on just that. And in so many of the stories, it's law enforcement. That is it. That is the only story. That is the only source that they're drawing from. It's the only people informed. The only person being quoted. There's nobody in the community being asked anything other than that. And it's really showing graphic photos and just making people afraid. And that is really something that concerns me. So I think there's a lot of choices that they can make in even running a story like that. Hey, pick up the phone and call a community leader, call one other person, call a local criminologist, get the data on this kind of stuff, put it in context. There's many more things they can do. Plus some of the terminology. I made a whole list of this stuff: mayhem, chaos. It's like all these words. I'm sure they looked them up in the dictionary. Some of them I had to look up, but they're words that are inflammatory, right? They don't need to use that kind of terminology to describe this. And plus, so few of these events, there's any violence. Very few of these events, there's violence. And so it makes it seem like the hundreds of people coming to these things are violent, when that's not really the case.
Sure. So for that last box of what isn't covered, I want to ask it to you in this way, because you're a person who has, as somebody who ran a nonprofit that did events in the community or did campaigns and then took on similar stuff with OJJ. What, in your experience there, was effective in getting those kinds of positive stories, or at least stories about pushback to the sort of business as usual? What worked for you? For the person listening to this, it's like, yeah, she's right. It's really hard to get anybody to pay attention to this stuff. Like, how did you do it? Because you were effective. It wasn't just the imprint writing about stuff you guys did. We saw it in local media. So what works?
There's a lot of things that work. I think the first and most important thing for your listeners is to invest in media resources, right? That you need people on your team who are dedicated to doing this work. It's not a side project. It has got to be part and parcel of the work, because our communications ability, and particularly now in this media environment where there's many more choices, but also many more options for people to put communications out there, is to invest some resources in that, right? That's one thing. I think another is to think about media hooks. What are ways that you can get media to bite on something, right? I learned a lot from Vinny Schiraldi running the Justice Policy Institute, where he would issue these short issue briefs and get media to cover that, right? Media need usually like a couple page report, something with some hard data in it, data that that is related to their community or their state or whoever you're trying to pitch. That kind of works. I've also used media hooks like anniversaries of things, right? The anniversary of the Juvenile Justice Act or a piece of legislation that passed in a place. I also found doing events, organizing actions, direct actions will often get media coverage. I know in today's environment, it's harder. So I think that part of what we have to do is be really creative. I know that's something young people are great at and using social media tools even more now than ever before. So creating some of your own media events, tools, products, things like that can help get the word across. I still think that policymakers follow a lot of what's in mainstream media. We can say all we want about all these other new kinds of things, but they really do care about what their local mainstream newspaper, radio, televisions are saying. So to the extent that people want to see changes is targeting those media. I'll give one example. When I was working on the Martinsville 7 pardon campaign, and I said, our target is the governor. The governor is the person who can give the pardon, even though they've never done it before. They've never given a posthumous pardon in Virginia. So I talked to other people and we said, what is the newspaper that governor is going to wake up on Sunday morning and read? What is going to be on his front porch? And we said, it's the Richmond Times-Dispatch. We knew it was going to be this one reporter, Frank Green. And so we targeted Frank Green. We called him. We gave him an exclusive. We said, here are members of the families of the Martinsville 7. They're willing to talk with you. They have issued a letter to the governor asking for a pardon. And Frank wrote a huge series on this. And then local news, radio, television across Virginia, particularly in Southwest Virginia, those reporters followed everything we did on that campaign. And in the end, the governor did issue the posthumous pardons. And I look at that example as one where we were very strategically focused on a specific action that we wanted from a specific policymaker. And it happened because people were focused on working with media to make sure media had the tools to write about it or report about it.
Can you think in your time in this space of like the most visceral example in the other direction of where you saw maybe one story or a string of stories legitimately lead to a regression in law or a punitive change?
I think we're seeing it right now. We are living it right now. It's just looking at how the teen takeover coverage has resulted in the imposition of curfews, in parent fines, in city ordinances. In some places, there have been some state law changes to fine parents. So I think we are living in that now. And it is reminiscent to me of the super predator era, right? Of when that terminology was used in media report after media report. People amplified that, and many states changed laws as a result of that. Now, that was combined oftentimes with something that happened in a community, an episodic, one-time, very violent crime. And that is what those things combined together, the terminology, the use of that frame, the way that media coverage was going, plus something happening in a community, that changed laws in a bunch of states. And I think that if we don't really make sure that media are aware of how the coverage impacts policy on young people, that's on us. So we've got to make sure that they've got these tools, this information, so that they can do responsible, ethical, fair, and balanced reporting.
The website is reportforyouthjustice.org. I'll drop a link to that in the show notes along with a direct link to Liz's first piece. So check that out. And editors and reporters who listen, hit up Liz for advice on all these things. Liz, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Thank you so much, John.
Thanks to Liz Ryan for joining us today. Go check out her new project, Report Youth Justice, and the Youth Justice Style Guide. Link to it is in our show notes. The Imprint Weekly podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org or email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.